Chris Jones is Chief Technology Officer at Nightwing. It's great to see you, Chris. Thanks for joining me today. What's the threat landscape look like now, and what do you see the evolution process looking like over the next couple of years?
I think everybody's probably tracking the most compelling issue with today's threat landscape is it's multi-domain. It's accelerating at a rapid pace, and it's incredibly challenging, I think, for our national security and industry leaders to have a risk framework to deal with that. I mean, we've always had complicated issues, right? We've always had multi-domain, and by multi-domain, I mean, cyber and physical domain, counterterrorism and counterproliferation weapons challenges and issues. It's a complex environment out there. But I think the acceleration of innovation in private industry, the fact that technology is being commoditized and you don't need to be a nation state to acquire it, I think that's the single biggest challenge is how do we adjust our risk framework to deal with threats that are evolving at a pace that is ever accelerating.
Mm-hmm. In that risk framework too, I imagine the wrinkle is that all of those things that could possibly go bad could also go bad at the same time.
Exactly. And I think, how do you actually come up with a calculus for where and how you deploy your resources, right? Hedging your bets on the protective side while enabling your collection requirements, right? And your policy objective needs. How do you adjust resources, people and dollars to address those threats when they're ever changing and quite frankly, they're integrated, right? We talk about space and the space domain challenges, but at the same time, we're talking about cyber being kind of the existential, right? Non-kinetic threat to our national security. Well, those aren't independent, right? You have to deal with space challenges while you're dealing with the cyber challenges concurrently. Where do you invest? How do you invest? And then how do you motivate a call to arms across both government and private industry to integrate and work those problems together? I think that's kind of the biggest challenge that we have right now.
The word that came to mind as you were talking was resilience, and yet in the cyber realm at least, resilience usually means ability to come back as quickly as possible to as close to the previous state as possible. That doesn't sound like that's quite the right concept for what you just described.
I agree. And I think, we had a good conversation this morning from Rob Joyce, right, former luminary at the NSA, and we were talking a little bit on the margins of that about, offensive cyber. Well, you can play defense all day, right? How do you know how much cyber resilience or how much cyber defense is the right amount before you simply have to say, we need to go on the offense with certain, capabilities? And how do we go beyond just cyber versus cyber? And how do we take all of the attributes and capabilities, diplomatic, military, political, economic, and technological as a nation state and say, this is how we're going to address threats to our freedom, our way of life moving forward. And I think pulling all of those threads at the same time requires a whole of government, really a whole of nation response. And so then you get into challenges with communication, coordination, data sharing. And I think it's 100% appropriate to say that cyber resilience, cyber defense is critical. But if that's the only lens that you're looking through, I think you're always going to be playing defense. And you can put an incredible amount of resources into that vector and really not be ahead of where you would be if you had invested in some alternative approaches. And so I think having kind of a complex, multi-domain, I would say interagency and cross-government and private sector approach to national security threats, that is the challenge. Coordination at that scale is the challenge. Communication at that scale is a challenge. Data sharing across that framework is incredibly complicated. And so I think that's kind of where we need to be going.
Who are all the people that should be at the table at building that type of an enterprise approach to the multi-domain concept?
Well, obviously, you have the national security enterprise and, the players inside of government, you have to have that. But I think, events like, here today with Insight and AFCEA, bringing the industrial base together, and not just the larges, but large and small innovators together, socializing everybody about what the challenges are, and then having a voice from industry to drive that conversation with the public sector, I think is critical. I think long gone are the days where the public sector is going to drive the innovation. I do think that the government has to accelerate the adoption, right? And there's always challenges to that. But again, getting back to the risk framework, there's a lot of risks to not adopting technology at I would say, an accelerated pace to what we see today. All right. I think everybody's trying to move faster in that space, but it's just challenging. But I think it's got to be a coalition across the federal space, state and local governments as well, and obviously the industrial base. And I think, being a political function and bringing that all together, I think is the key. And I think we have lots of forums to do that today, but we've got to really double and triple down on the fact that, our adversaries don't always draw these lines between public and private entities. And in many cases, it's really hard to discern whether that really is a private entity from some of our adversaries. And so we've got to compete as one if we're going to be in that space. And so I think that coordination requires leadership. I think we've seen it in several areas. I think organizations like meeting here at INSA and FCA represent that, but we've got to scale it up.